Today we're going to be taking a look at the last of the philosophers that really is attached to the ancient Roman world, and the first of the philosophers that is attached to what's going to be known as the Middle Ages. He's kind of a transitional figure, the guy that we know as St. Augustine or Augustine of Hippo. Now, he's a Christian philosopher, he's going to be the first philosopher that has a different worldview from the prevailing paganism of the ancient Greek and Roman era. We've been looking at all the philosophers up to this point have been part of the Greco-Roman tradition. Now, he is going to be heavily influenced by Greek and Roman philosophy, particularly the tradition within Platonism. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go into the life of Augustine, a little bit of a background, who he was, when he lived, what he did, and eventually take a look at his philosophical, I guess you can say, conversion, and eventually his conversion to Christianity, because he was not a Christian throughout his entire life. He was not raised as a Christian, or maybe I should say he was raised kind of as a Christian. His mother was a Christian, as you'll see, but let's actually get into the background before I get too far ahead of myself. His dates, let me go back one slide, whose dates are between 354 and 430. So he's right at the tail end of the Roman Empire. Though he doesn't live long enough to actually see the collapse of the empire in 476, he was seeing some of the conditions that resulted in the collapse of the empire, like the barbarian invasions, which he had firsthand experience of. So let's go ahead and take a look at his background. Aurelius Augustinus was his name. He's actually from North Africa. He was born November 13, 354, in a place known as Tagaste, which is in Numidia. Here is a map of the northern coast of North Africa. You can actually see Sicily just across the way, and Tagaste is circled right there. Okay, it's a little south of Hippo, which you could see on the map. This is not the best map because of so many names being on it, but Hippo is just north of Tagaste, slightly northeast on the coast. His parents, Patricius and Monica. His father was a Roman pagan, and his mother was a Christian, lifelong Christian. His father, at some point, supposedly did convert to Christianity near the end of his life, but it was Monica that was going to have a long kind of struggle with her son, Augustine, about the faith. I mean, she was a person that wanted, a very fervent believer in Christianity, and wanted her son to become a Christian, which is something that he's going to resist heavily throughout most of his early life. As far as his education goes, he studied Latin classics, he studied grammar, he studied rhetoric at a place known as Medora, which is right here in respect to Tagaste, so it's not far from his hometown. That's where he did a lot of his study. And then he ended up moving to Carthage, which I'm going to get to in just a second. In these early years, actually right there in 370, here's Carthage on the map. It's a little bit smaller map, but you can see Carthage on the coast, a little east of Hippo. And it's in Carthage around this time that he actually takes on a mistress. Right, he has a long-standing relationship with a woman whose name I don't believe we have. And with her, he had a son. By 372, his son was born, Deodatus, very important figure in his life. And Augustine, being a person that was interested in education, had a passion for figuring out truth. Okay, he was a truth seeker, and early on, he actually turns to philosophy. Maybe not as much as he will later on, but he turns to philosophy when he reads Cicero. And I know we've talked about Cicero only in passing, especially at the end of the Roman Republic. He was a figure that was contemporary with Julius Caesar, with Octavian, or Mark Antony. Ended up dying, if you remember, at the hands of the Second Triumvirate back in the late Republic. And he had written on a number of topics, including philosophy, and there was a work that was called the Hortensius, that was something that really impacted Augustine. He read it and became interested in the topic. We don't actually have this writing, by the way. Cicero's Hortensius is lost to us. The only reason we know about it is because of writings like Augustine, who mentions it. Anyways, he not only dabbles in philosophy, but he also dabbles in a religion known as Manichaeism or Manichaeanism, and becomes what's called a hearer. And a hearer is kind of a lower echelon member of this religion. There were the fully immersed individuals that are called the elect. Now, Manichaeism, he believed, presented a rational presentation of truth, okay, as opposed to Christianity, which he came to see as very irrational. It was a system of irrational doctrine, which is one of the reasons he kind of put it aside and moved away from his mother's faith into this other faith. And the background for Manichaeism is something that comes up in Iran. There was a prophet by the name of Mani who lived between 260 and 274, actually ended up being effectively executed by the Persians in 274. And it was a religion that emerged kind of out of Zoroastrianism and out of Christianity. Mani basically presented himself as the last of a series of prophets, which included people like Zarathustra, people like Jesus, but also people like Buddha and Krishna. So he was drawing on ideas that were widespread in the East as well as, Judaism and Christianity in the West. And it's kind of a Gnostic religion, and not that we can really define Gnosticism very clearly, but Gnosticism tends to be a religion that believes in special knowledge, and his version draws on the dualistic worldview that we see come across in the Zoroastrian tradition, where you've got good and evil, light and dark, kind of in a struggle with one another. And if you remember the Zoroastrian tradition, we've got the god Ahura Mazda and the antithesis, the figure of Ahura Mainyu. And in the Manichaeism, there is Ormazd and Ahriman, which are later versions of the same two characters. Now, Ormazd would be the good component, the god of light, but not an omnipotent type of a being. So you don't have an omnipotent, all-knowing God in Manichaeism. Again, we've got this idea of light and dark, and the soul of the individual is considered kind of the light. Okay, and the body that the soul is attached to would be considered a dark, gross, material thing that's much lower than the soul. Okay, so it's similar to what we've seen in Platonism, as a matter of fact, which we're going to get into a little bit more as we go forward. But it, again, I guess like Platonism or like Orphism or like Pythagoreanism, also advocated asceticism, which emphasized fasting again, avoiding eating of meat. It actually avoided something which sounds kind of extreme. If you're not going to eat meat, it assumes that you would be a vegetarian, but it also recommended not killing of plants, which seems to put you in a pretty interesting situation. The resolution there, if you're interested, is that because this was only something that was embraced by those elect within the cult or within the religion, the people that were at the lower level were allowed to harvest plants, and then the upper echelon elect would be able to eat them, so you could still live a vegetarian lifestyle without being guilty of killing life. Because again, plants, animals, it's all life. So that was a kind of a big prohibition there. And also the prohibition against sex. Now you could see clearly, because I just mentioned Augustine had this long relationship with this woman, that he was not interested in becoming an elect, okay, and moving into that upper echelon where he would have to put aside those types of things. He's going to remain a hearer, and he's kind of interested in an intellectual level, okay, and what they have to say, because he believed that they did have answers to the big questions. And one of the big questions that he has to do with evil, right? The problem of pain, the problem of suffering. Now, he eventually returns to his hometown in 373, to Gast, where he begins to teach. He has a career as a teacher of grammar, as a teacher of literature and rhetoric, and later he moves on to Carthage, back to Carthage, I guess, where he ends up opening a school of rhetoric. And it's here that he has the opportunity to publish his first work, his first written text, which is called De Pulchra and Aptu, okay, on the beautiful and the fitting, which is kind of a Platonic work. As far as we know, we don't actually have this anymore. It's lost to us, but it was his first work. So he starts his writing career fairly early, around the time that he's beginning his teaching career. In Carthage, he comes in contact with a very famous Manichae bishop by the name of Faustus. Now, Faustus was presented to him as a guy who could answer some of his tougher questions. A lot of the Manichaees that he was interacting with really couldn't address the big concerns that he had, like, the problem of evil, for instance. So he turns to this guy Faustus, hoping to have an intellectual answer to his deep questions that he's wrestling with, and his encounter left him really disillusioned with Manichaeism because Faustus was not able to respond sufficiently to his questions. And he said, well, maybe Manichaeism doesn't have the answers. Maybe, they're presenting themselves in such a way that is not going to live up to his expectations. And he starts to turn his back on Manichaeism, and he's going to slowly move away from that religion. At the same time, he's moving to Rome for the first time, 383. He leaves North Africa, goes to the capital city. Shortly, he's followed by his mother. By the way, I think I mentioned his mother being a fervent Christian was somebody that was really struggling with him having, really rejected Christianity and embraced these other religions. And she's kind of not only praying for him to come to Christianity, but she's kind of pursuing him, and obviously in a physical way, because she follows him again to Europe. Anyways, in this time that he's becoming disillusioned with Manichaeism, he is also moving towards academic skepticism, which you may remember is the movement within the early academy of Plato that becomes very much against the idea that you could have the confidence of knowledge, or that we could attain any kind of certainty in our pursuits. Skepticism, remember, shows up in a lot of different schools, particularly in the pre- and Hellenistic era within philosophy, and it's going to be the type of system that shows up over and over and over again. So there's still academic skeptics, even though we're clearly in a period that's post-Plotinus, right? You've got Neoplatonism on the field. You've got academic skepticism that still has people following that tradition. So it's not that the Platonic system has returned fully to something like Plotinus gives us with Neoplatonism, and academic skepticism absolutely disappeared. It didn't. Okay, so it was still out there, and he embraces that at this stage of his life. He ends up moving from Rome up to Milan in 384. He has a post where he was going to be a professor of rhetoric up in Milan and was employed by the Roman government up there. He ends up meeting a very important figure by the name of Ambrose, who was the bishop in Milan, so clearly a Christian figure, but what made him come to Augustine's attention was the fact that Ambrose had a really impressive resume as a great rhetorician. He was an incredible public speaker, and Augustine, who was a professor of rhetoric, was interested in meeting a guy like Ambrose, learning something from him, interacting with him a little bit. And this was something that his mother was really in favor of, because Ambrose not only was a great rhetorician, he was one of the great minds in Christianity of the day. Okay? Now, he does end up getting more immersed in Platonism, also during his time in Italy. Apparently reads Plotinus, or he's referred to as reading the Platonists. We're assuming it was Plotinus's Enneads that he was able to come across. And his Neoplatonism that emerges is ultimately going to be a break with his academic skepticism. It's going to move him away from a materialistic worldview, and it's going to also be able to address some of his philosophical questions, particularly the question of evil, which continued to plague him. So we're going to get into those thoughts a little bit shortly. But right after his intellectual or philosophical conversion, he actually does have a religious conversion. And this happens in 386. It's known as the Garden Conversion. And apparently he was in the garden one day, and he hears in the distance a child singing a song which repeated over and over again the Latin phrase tolle lege, which means take and read, take and read. And after hearing this, he was kind of distraught at the time. He goes in and he picks up a copy of Paul's epistle to the Romans, opens it and starts to read what Paul has to say. And for the first time, he says his eyes are essentially opened, and he ends up abandoning his former life and embracing the Christianity of his mother. Now, after that, he becomes baptized. He is actually baptized by Ambrose right there in Milan in 387. And then he ends up moving back to North Africa. Unfortunately, in the intervening little bit of time, his mother dies. She dies in Italy before they sail back to North Africa at a place known as Ostia, which I think I mentioned before. This was the port of Rome, so it's kind of on their way back down to the capital city. And I guess it's a happy death for her, because remember, she had been praying fervently for her son to become Christian, and she actually lived long enough to witness that take place. He has another tragedy not long after he arrives back in his hometown of Tagaste. He has the loss of his son. So within a year, he basically loses his mother. He loses his son, two of the most important figures in his life, two of the most important people in his life. I don't think I mentioned, but he had separated from his mistress years earlier. So he's basically on his own at this point. He ends up founding a monastic community in North Africa, which was a community of people that are, dedicate their lives to a particular lifestyle of prayer and devotion to God. Ends up in 391 being ordained as a priest up in the city of Hippo. Founds another monastic community there. And when he is ordained, it's kind of interesting that he's ordained at the instigation of the congregation at Hippo. It was actually, they brought him forward and kind of forced him to be ordained a priest. I guess he was popular enough in the community, and they respected him enough. They thought he would be a good priest for them, which he was, and later becomes bishop right there in Hippo in 395. He's an auxiliary bishop, and then in the next year, he succeeds as the ruling bishop of the city of Hippo, which is where he's going to be for the rest of his life. Right? That's why we call him St. Augustine of Hippo, because he was the head bishop of a very important city right there in North Africa. His death follows many years later, 430 AD. He dies, and when he dies in Hippo, the city itself was under siege by the Vandals. If you remember, the Vandals is one of the Germanic tribes that had come through and taken territory in Spain and moved on to North Africa. Eventually, was going to sack the city of Rome in 455. Well, he doesn't witness the sacking of the city. He actually dies before Hippo is taken. But he's seeing, like I said, the beginnings of the collapse of the empire. The situation was breaking down. As a matter of fact, earlier in 410, the city of Rome itself had been sacked. And it was that sacking of Rome by the Visigoths that prompted him, in an indirect way, to write one of his other really important works, a work called The City of God. And the condition was the city being sacked caused a lot of people to start to accuse the weakening of the empire, actually blaming the weakening of the empire on Christianity. Because the previous empire, right, or the earlier empire, which had been devoted to Jupiter and the Roman gods, was a strong empire. The city had never been sacked for like 800 years. All of a sudden, we turn our backs on the pagan religion of the ancestors, and all of a sudden, the city of Rome falls to these barbarians, and there's got to be some connection. Because remember, it's not just the Romans, but it's also early Christians and lots of people in the ancient world that believed that the fortunes of a society, the fortunes of a state, were intimately tied in to the religion. Right? That's why they require, and many emperors sacrifice to the Roman gods for the sake of the state. Same idea here among the pagans of Augustine's day. Now, Augustine writes The City of God basically to defend the idea that Christianity didn't have anything to do with the sacking of Rome, that there were other reasons for that, and it's a long tome basically on critique of paganism, and it sets up this idea of a city of God versus a city of man idea, and actually presents kind of an early version of a philosophy of history from a Christian point of view. Anyway, since I'm already talking about some of his writings, let's go ahead and just address how prolific a writer he was. He left behind a lot of material. Like I said, we've already lost some of the stuff. Definitely his pre-Christian material has been primarily lost to us. But he's going to be one of the greatest thinkers, period, maybe in world history, but definitely in Christian theology and Christian philosophy. And he's going to have a huge impact, like I said earlier, on the thinkers that follow him, particularly within that tradition. And the amount of stuff he produced during his Christian period alone is massive. During his time in Carthage, he was writing prior to his conversion. After his conversion, he produces at least 117 more books. And this is just the number of books that we have today, right? The works that are still extant, meaning they haven't disappeared. Okay, so we can guess that he wrote, well beyond this. Out of these works, he wrote against a number of ideas that were out there. Manichaeism, which he had participated in. He writes against Manichaeanism. He writes against heresies within the Christian faith, such as Arianism. When I say a heresy, this was ended up becoming declared a heresy basically at the Council of Nicaea. I know he addressed the Council of Nicaea during the time of Constantine. Back when we did the early Christianity and even recapped it when we talked about the late Roman Empire. The controversy, I don't know if I spelled out very clearly, but it was a controversy over the nature of Christ, or the nature of Jesus, whether he was human or divine, right? Rather, if Christ was God, or if he was some kind of lesser being. The Arian point of view is that Christ was not fully God, and that's why the Nicene Creed actually includes the idea that Christ is fully God, fully man, as part of the doctrine, or part of the creedal proclamation from Nicaea. And it was a condemnation of Arianism. But Arianism didn't disappear. It was still fairly popular. As a matter of fact, it was popular with many of the barbarian tribes that had been moving into the Roman Empire. So when Rome, like I said, in 410 was sacked by the Visigoths, I don't want you to think the Visigoths were just some kind of pagan barbarian tribe. They had been partially Romanized and definitely Christianized by the time they sacked Rome, which gives you maybe a different point of view on what was going on at the end of the Roman Empire. But so he attacks Arianism, he attacks Pelagianism, which was another teaching that came out of really Britain. There was a British monk by the name of Pelagius, and this controversy that evolved had to do with his point of view that it was not necessary to have grace in order to be saved as a Christian, that humans had the ability in and of themselves to kind of save themselves or move towards God, and Augustine doesn't embrace that view, so he kind of argues against Pelagius' point of view. And he also argues against a group known as the Donatists, which were kind of a puritanical group that had trouble with the idea that a person who has lapsed in their faith could provide a legitimate sacrament to a Christian. Let me maybe put it in this sense, the sacrament of baptism. What happens, this is one of the questions, what happens if a priest performs a baptism on somebody and then later that same priest ends up recanting their faith, say at the instigation of the Roman government, right? When paganism was persecuting Christians, when the Roman government was persecuting Christians, they would be asked to sacrifice to the empire, deny their faith, or something along those lines. Well, what happens with those people that do deny their faith? Does that negate the sacrament of baptism that they bestowed on another Christian? The Donatists actually said it did. All right, they're not true Christians, therefore the sacrament is null and void. And Augustine kind of takes the position that it doesn't matter what the individual person does; it's the act of God through the sacrament that has its effect on the individual. So he really argues against some of these different ideas, okay, both within and without Christianity. He doesn't just write against different ideas. He also writes on behalf of ideas within the faith. He writes heavily on the concept of the Trinity. In one of his greatest works, De Trinitate, he works on the issue of free will, which is a huge philosophical topic that we're going to touch on a little bit later, but is something that I don't know anybody has ever fully resolved. He writes his two most famous works, The Confessions and The City of God, Confessions being his autobiography, which is really a very honest portrayal of himself as he basically psychoanalyzes, his life, presents a very honest picture of himself prior to his conversion to Christianity, and definitely critiques his former lifestyle. And then The City of God, which I already mentioned, which is a kind of a philosophy of history written to defend Christianity against the accusations of the pagans. All right. Those two works are easy to find. You can find copies of them on the internet. You can find them in any good bookstore. As a matter of fact, you'll probably find most of those things on the internet nowadays. City of God, like I said, is a massive, massive work. And it's amazing, like I said, if he writes 117 volumes, the fact that some of them were so massive just kind of boggles the mind. Anyways, let's talk about his philosophy. Let's talk about his Neoplatonism, for instance. When we talked about Christianity and Greco-Roman thought, we talked about the interaction of pagan thought and Christianity, Greco-Roman thought, and Judeo-Christian thought. And one of the things that I mentioned is that the thinking of the philosophers didn't only impact writers like Paul in the New Testament, but they're going to have a big impact on the thinkers that follow. And the church fathers, Augustine being one of them, is going to definitely embrace Platonism. Now, what you're going to see in his progressive career as a thinker and as a writer is a shift in his thinking. You see his earlier writings differ from his later writings. So His earlier writings, I think, are more heavily influenced by Plotinus, Porphyry, Plato. But they're really important in his, like I said, philosophical conversion, which ultimately helps him make his later religious conversion. Because remember, Plotinus, Plato, those guys are people that believe there is something real that is beyond the sensible realm, something beyond the material realm. So this helps him get past his earlier materialism and helps him start to move towards this idea that we can be certain about things that are outside the sensible realm. Okay, so he's beginning to be opened through Platonism to the reality of an immaterial world. And that's really important because you can't embrace the Christian worldview without embracing the idea that there is something that is out there that is immaterial, namely God and other things like that. So as far as Neoplatonic views go, you've got the idea of lots of different things. So I'm just going to line up a number of the things that he's going to embrace, even though he has a variation on maybe certain things that Plotinus gives us. So I'm going to contrast a little bit of Augustine and Plotinus as I do this. But he accepts this idea of a transcendent God and the fact that this God is causally immanent. This is a little bit like the idea of the one in Plotinus, right? It's up there, it's above everything, but it also is responsible for everything that flows down in this emanation process from the one. So for Augustine, there's a God, and everything else that is created by God is, again, causally related to God, and that God brings it into being. Okay. Now there are some differences, obviously, between the one and God, which we can get into a little bit later, but he does embrace as well the theory of ideas, the idea that there are these archetypal forms. Now Augustine places them in the mind of God, where Plotinus puts them into the realm of what's called the nous, which is the first emanation from the one. I know you need to remember a little bit about emanation theory to follow along here, but I'll try to kind of refresh your memory as we go. He believes in, like the emanation theory, that there's a hierarchical order of being, right? There's a higher and there's a lower, moving from God down, the way you move from the one down to the material realm. And there's a superiority in this order from that has to deal with immutability, the idea of changeability. All right, when I say something is immutable, I mean it doesn't change. So the more immutable it is, the more perfect it is, the higher it is on this hierarchy. So the one for Plotinus is absolutely immutable. God for Augustine is absolutely immutable. And then you work your way down. So there's this idea that eventually you get to the soul. And the soul, he believes, is an immaterial thing and it's an immortal thing. He doesn't necessarily refer to it as an eternal thing the way Plotinus or Plato was, or did. But there's going to be a little bit of a distinction there, which we'll get into. He does also make a distinction between the intelligible and sensible, that which we can grasp with our minds versus that which we can grasp with the senses. He has a counterpart to Plato's idea of recollection and the idea of what's called illumination. I'll try to unpack that a little bit later. It's kind of a confusing one. And he also believes in this upward ascent towards truth, that we move upward from the sensible realm to our knowledge of God at the very top. Counterpoint to Plotinus's idea of an upward movement towards an ultimate unio, right, with the one, this mystical experience that he talks about in his writings. And then he also has a perspective on evil that really is developed out of the Platonic worldview, and it's this idea of evil as what we might call a privation. Okay, this is a question, remember, the Manichaeans couldn't answer for him, but he does find an acceptable answer in Platonism. All right, so let's take a look at his actual philosophy, and we'll start with his ontology, which is his understanding of being, the nature of, what bees. That's what ontology really talks about. So it's a hierarchical arrangement, as we just said. So we're going to draw this in kind of a triangular format. At the very top of this hierarchical chain is the thing that is most real. It is God. And like the one, this is something that is absolutely immutable. And when I say something, I probably should use the term someone, because in the worldview of Augustine, God is a person, okay, or has the characteristics of personhood. Not an impersonal type of thing that we find in Plato or Plotinus. Now, God is still transcendent, meaning it's above all the things that come below it and is ultimately completely different from them, but God is also causally present in all things in that he holds them in existence. Right? There's this relationship between the creation and the creator. And this God creates willingly. This is not just a flowing down necessarily and eternally from the one that we had in emanation theory. This is something that happens because God wants it to happen and wills it to happen. There was a time, I shouldn't say a time, before there was a creation. That's actually something Augustine would think is incoherent to talk about a time before time, but there's an idea that time began at a certain point, right? It's not an eternal universe idea like you get among the other thinkers before this worldview. He has a soul, which is going to follow next in the chain of being, and the soul is lesser than God, but it's above the body in that it is immutable in a certain respect. It's immutable in space because it's immaterial, can't change in location, but it is mutable in time. There can be changes within the soul chronologically. Now, the body is the lowest on the hierarchy because it is mutable both in space and time. As a physical thing, it can move, it could change physically, but it also can change chronologically. Okay, so the idea here is the less changeable something is, the higher it is in the order of being, which is why God's absolutely at the top and everything physical is absolutely at the bottom. Okay, so this very much lines up, like I said, with Plotinus, with Plato. Now, the question of body-soul dualism is a little bit more complex because Augustine changes his perspective a little bit over time on this idea. His earlier Platonic view was very much a crude dualism, where you've got the body, which is a material substance, and then you've got the soul, which is this superior immaterial rational substance that rules the body, right? And may have even been eternal, because in Plato's conception, the soul, remember, is reincarnated from life to life. It has always been there. It's always going to be there. It just goes through these cycles. Now, this Platonic view of body and soul, he eventually puts away as he realizes that's incompatible with what he finds in Scripture. So again, what he's going to do is he's going to kind of critique his own Platonism according to what he has embraced religiously. And it's going to force him, right, like I said, Platonism is not the same. It might be similar to things we find in the New Testament, but is definitely different than what we find in the New Testament. So his view morphs, okay? He ends up having a view where there's a body-soul unity in a different way, maybe a perfect composite. These two things are actually united in such a way that we could say that the body is part of the human nature, right? It's not just the soul that's you. The whole thing is you. So the body is actually proper to you. It belongs to the nature of man to be a physical being, not just a spiritual being. Now, the soul might be higher when it comes to its immutability, when it comes to spiritual matters, intellectual matters, and things like that. And it can even exist, being consistent with the New Testament, there's even the idea that it can exist apart from the body, but ultimately its place belongs united to the body, okay, which is why you have this idea in Judeo-Christianity of a resurrection. Okay, so it's actually desirable, he comes to believe, for the soul to reside within a body. It's not ideal to have it separated that you would get from kind of the Greek thinkers. All right, so he has that body-soul duality, but in a different sense from Plato. And then let's take a look at his epistemology, which is his theory of knowledge. Now, ontology and epistemology usually work in different directions. Ontology kind of works top-down, and then epistemology usually begins bottom up, and that as we come to know something, as we develop our knowledge, we work from where we begin, right, in the sensible realm in a certain way. So you still have to understand the hierarchy of being. So when we talk about this epistemology, let's actually put it into a hierarchical arrangement as well, starting with what he has at the very top, which is God. And this is where you're going to have what are called the rationes aeternae, which are the divine ideas, the eternal ideas, what we might call the forms, or what Plato might call the forms, right? The archetypal forms or ideas reside up in the mind of God here. And that's going to be a change. Obviously, you don't have a mind of God in Plotinus or Plato. The idea of the forms or ideas exist up there somewhere, or in the realm of the nous for Plotinus. So now they're going to be located in God, okay? At the next level, you've got the ratio hominis, which will be the ideas within man. You've got the superior and the inferior. The superior ratio looks upward towards the eternal ideas in the mind of God, and this is what's going to allow us to produce wisdom, or sapientia. The inferior reason looks down at the sensible world and is going to allow us to produce a lower form of knowledge that is just simply called scientia, which is where we get the word science from. Okay? Now, at the very bottom happen to be the rationes seminales, or to be the forms or ideas that are within the things themselves. So we could think of, the tree having the form of the tree in it. This is why things develop according to their natures, right? Why a tree is a tree and a man is a man or a dog is a dog, because they have these seeds, these forms within them. Okay, and this is the way that God creates. Okay, in his theology, in his philosophy, God, who has the divine idea, then creates according to these ideas and puts that form into the different things he creates. Okay, which distinguishes one from another. Now, how we come to knowledge is going to be this upward movement. Like I said, we begin in the sensible realm. So you have this intellectual or spiritual ascent. Now, Plato and Plotinus have the same kind of idea, right? Plato gives us this idea of an upward movement from the cave, right? This whole analogy of moving out of darkness into the light, right? He talks about. Plotinus has this upward movement towards union with the one. And these are going to involve for Augustine this turning inward and upward. We're going to move from the bodies ultimately to the soul, from the sensible realm to the intelligible realm. We go from knowledge of things ultimately to knowledge of ourself, and ultimately to the highest knowledge, which is going to be knowledge of God or the good. Now, Plato uses the term good to talk about this highest form, right? This thing that's above everything else. For Augustine, the good is going to be God himself, or God and truth. These are all one thing. When we talk about good, what we're talking about is God. When we talk about truth, what we're talking about is God. Everything is kind of united at the top. Now, the stages of movement upward are going to begin with sensation, right? So that's our first contact with, as we approach knowledge, right? And sensation gives you access again to sensible things. This is the senses of taste, touch, hearing, etc. The objects of the sensible world are particular things. So we could look out and we could see the tree, we could see the dog, whatever. The next level, we're going to need to make judgments. So that's going to be what he calls cogitation. We're going to judge things that we see in the sensible realm according to these archetypes that we have in mind. This rational knowledge is going to be produced. Now, this is a little bit confusing because remember, Plato says we can't have knowledge of sensible things. All we get is opinion. Okay, so how can he talk about there being knowledge of sensible things, right? How can he talk about scientia at all? Now, remember, that's the root word for science, and science today, when we think of science, has to do with empiricism and the idea of using our senses to investigate the world around us. All right, so he says we can have rational knowledge of particulars, but only insofar as they approximate these divine ideas, right? His conception, by the way, of knowledge includes not just things we learn through the senses, but also going to include things that we learn through witnesses, okay, reliable witnesses, kind of secondhand information. Because obviously we don't know everything firsthand. We can't possibly know everything firsthand. We've got to take people's word on it in very many ways. And that ends up being a little bit more in line of what he also referred to as faith, right? So faith for Augustine is the idea of giving assent to truths that we think are worthy of belief. Okay, I guess that's when we make certain judgments about them. When we make judgments about the people that are giving us this secondhand information, do we find them to be reliable witnesses? Okay. So this is the idea of trust. And I guess you could say sense perception is as well a type of faith, not because it isn't firsthand, right? Because we do have access to the world through our senses directly, but because the type of objects that we're looking at are the type of objects that change. And this is why Plato says we can't ever know them. They're changeable things. Now, for Augustine, he is going to say we can have knowledge, but it has to do with the forms that we're going to judge those sensibles according to, right? We got these unchangeable forms that we judge the changeable particulars according to. All right, and at the very top, you've got intellection, which is where you contemplate the eternal ideas, and that's where you get full knowledge or wisdom produced, or sapientia. Okay, so very Platonic, but has some changes. Now, he begins his quest for knowledge, kind of in his philosophical system. He begins with starting at arguing against skepticism that he previously held. So let's start with his arguments against radical skepticism as we move upward. The academic claim was that you can never be sure right? You can never know that you've absolutely grasped the truth, and you always have to withhold your consent in order to avoid having some kind of false opinion or falling into error. Now, Augustine is going to use this concept of error to actually put together a case against absolute doubt, right? He's going to say that there is the possibility of having certainty in knowledge, and we can be immune from doubt in certain cases, and he's going to give proofs for this. So proof is going to be a kind of a philosophical argument that attempts to show or demonstrate something with certainty. Okay, so he's going to start with what we might call formal and mathematical certainty, or formal and mathematical truth. So let's start with logical truth. He's going to say, for instance, that we can know without a doubt and certainly that all disjunctions are true. Now, if you don't know what a disjunction is, it's the idea of something being X or non-X. That type of claim is called a disjunctive claim. Something is a dog or it's not a dog. Now, that statement is the type of statement that we can know for a fact is true because it's essentially one of the fundamental laws of logic. It's called the law of the excluded middle. Right? Now, formal logic, the principles of logic, the laws of logic are actually undeniable, he believes. So we can be certain in them. As a matter of fact, if you're going to try to argue against the laws of logic, you actually have to employ the laws of logic to do that, which only shows you even more that these are undeniable truths. Okay, so we can at least be certain of certain fundamental logical laws. You could also be absolutely certain when it comes to things like math. Math is a logical basically a logical type of thinking as well. It's a form of logic. So here we could say maybe 7 plus 3 equals 10. That's something I can also be absolutely certain about. Okay, these things obviously don't have anything to do with the senses, right? This is all purely intellectual. But he then goes on and talks about our sense experience and tries to make an argument that a private and subjective certainty can be held as well, which sounds a little bit hard to grasp, right? Because we're dealing with things that change. And our perceptions, we know, are different from perceptions other people have. So let me give you an example of how he says we can have certainty at this level. He gives an illustration of what's the oar illustration, or what we might call the bent oar illustration. If you've ever taken an oar and put it into the water, you'll notice, if you look down at the oar, that it appears to be bent. And that's at least according to your eyes. Of course, you could reach your hand into the water and feel the oar, and it might feel straight. And now you've got two different perceptions, and it's really interesting that you are going to say, okay, well, which perception do I trust? We tend to think, okay, my eyes are fooling me because my hand is showing me that it's straight. But what makes you think you can rely on the sensation you get from your sense of touch? Why is that more reliable than your sense of sight? Now, he's going to say, ultimately, he's going to kind of cut across that whole debate and say the one thing we can be certain of might not be the thing whether the oar is straight or bent, but we are definitely certain that the thing appears to us in a certain way. It appears to us as we perceive it, right? So when I'm seeing the oar appear bent, then I am certain that I am having the perception of bent oar. Okay, and if I touch the oar and feel like the oar is straight, I have the certainty that my sensation is telling me it's a straight oar. So I am at least certain of the perception that I'm having. Now, that doesn't really get rid of everything the skeptic would throw at Augustine, because he hasn't given us access to actual knowledge of what the situation is in reality with the oar, but it's kind of besides the point, as we'll see in a little bit. I just want to go a little bit further because he gives some other arguments that are somewhat interesting. The next one being his knowledge of self. He basically says, I can be certain that I exist. And the Latin phrase, si fallor sum, means if I err or if I make a mistake, I am. And that might sound familiar if you've studied any modern philosophy, particularly the philosopher Descartes, who said something similar when he said, what is Descartes' phrase? I think, therefore I am. I can't believe I forgot. That's such a famous line. I think, therefore I am. And the similarity, a lot of people actually speculated whether Descartes actually drew on Augustine when he comes up with his cogito. But here's the way this essentially works for I'll do a kind of Descartes' view first, and then I'll talk about Augustine's argument in a second. But Descartes attempts to prove that we can know something with certainty if we start with systematic doubting of everything. So he wants to use the process of doubt to get at an undeniable starting point for his entire philosophical system. And he says, okay, I'm going to doubt everything that I could possibly doubt. And then he tries to see if there's anything that's indubitable, right? Anything that's beyond doubt. And he realizes, okay, everybody doubts. And if I doubt, for instance, that I'm doubting, is that even possible to doubt that I'm doubting? Because if you think about it for a second, if you doubt that you're doubting, the more you doubt that, the more you actually prove that you're doubting. So he ends up realizing that doubting your doubt is actually something you cannot do. So he could be certain that he doubts. And then he goes on from there to realize, well, if he is certain that he's doubting is only a type of thought, therefore he is certain that he's thinking. And if thinking is going on, there's got to be a thinker behind the thinking, therefore he must exist. That's why he gets this phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. It's a very simple argument for self-existence. Now, Augustine gives something similar to this. He's going to attack skepticism by starting with the idea of error, right? The thing the skeptic wants to avoid is error, which is why they're going to withhold judgment. Well, he's going to say, okay, what if I do err? What if I do make a mistake? Okay, he's going to show that we can't err in absolutely everything. For instance, we can't err when we say we exist. He's going to attempt to prove our existence through this idea of erring. And then he's going to go on to say that we can also know that we know things. Okay, so let's take a look at his actual argument that's found in the City of God. It's actually found in a couple of his different writings. And it goes like this. I'm going to read it. It's a little bit lengthy, but it's interesting if you try to think through it. He says, if I'm mistaken, I exist. A non-existent being cannot be mistaken, therefore I must exist if I'm mistaken. Then, since my being mistaken proves that I exist, how can I be mistaken in thinking that I exist, seeing that my mistake establishes my existence? Since, therefore, I must exist in order to be mistaken, then even if I am mistaken, there can be no doubt that I'm not mistaken in my knowledge that I exist. Okay? So you can be mistaken in certain things, but that's not one of them. It follows that I'm not mistaken in knowing that I know. For just as I know I exist, I also know that I know. So here he ends up with certainty about both existence and knowledge in the end when he starts with this idea of potentially being mistaken. It's kind of an interesting way to argue. But this kind of internal cognition, right? He's kind of reflecting on his own thought process. It doesn't guarantee that we can be certain about knowledge of the senses, right? This is where the skeptic is going to come back and say, yeah, you could show that you're aware of your sensation that the oar is bent, but it doesn't tell you whether or not the oar is actually bent. You might know that you exist, but you might not know anything out there in the sensible realm. The sensible, changeable objects, Plato would say, only give us opinion. They don't give us certainty. But Augustine isn't really concerned about the material world in his thinking at all. All he wants to establish is that there is the ability to know certain things, that we can attain certain truths without doubt, and therefore the whole idea of radical skepticism needs to be abandoned. Because what he's really concerned with is not, like I said, the sensible, but with the immaterial. He's concerned with knowledge ultimately of God, the higher types of knowledge. So when he's arguing, along the lines of logical truth and mathematical truth, those are the types of knowledge that have to do, again, with the immaterial, the upper wisdom, right, as we move upward. And that's the whole goal. Right, so I don't think he was trying to really answer the question of can we rely on the senses so much as can we rely on our intellect to get us to truth in the greater scheme of things. Right, so this upward path of knowledge now, let's trace this up a little bit further. We've got problems when you look at Plato, right? We've got the idea of moving upward towards the one in Plotinus or towards God. For Platonism, you got this idea that truth is unchanging at the top, and truth is independent of our senses, and it requires, therefore, an unchanging immaterial object. If we're going to know anything, it's got to be the forms, right? And you have to have first-hand acquaintance with the forms to say that you know things. So I want you to remember this idea of first-hand acquaintance. It becomes really, really important here. Now, for Plato, how do you get first-hand acquaintance with a form which is not here in the physical world when you're stuck in a physical body? Well, he says we get that through recollection, right? The idea that the soul is reincarnated. It has contact with the forms when it's disembodied. When it's put into a body in the reincarnation, it obscures that knowledge, right? The body causes you to forget everything that you once knew. So the senses are merely an occasion to remember what you already know. You don't ever learn anything in the physical. You simply remember things in the physical. So everything you know, according to Plato, was a priori, is prior to experience. Now, here's the problem when it comes to Augustine. Remember, he's going to reject ideas that seem to be incompatible with Christianity. One of those ideas is the idea of the soul being eternal and there being a reincarnation. So Augustine is going to reject Platonic recollection. He can't have that in his system. The soul is not eternal or pre-existent. It might be, everlasting once it's created, but it's not eternal. It hasn't always been there. So, this gets us back to the theory of forms. He does embrace the idea that the forms are real, right? That they exist. For Plato, they were being. For Augustine, they're less than being, because the only thing that is pure being is God himself. But where do the forms exist? That's the big question. For Plato, they're out there somewhere, right? It's kind of vague. But this creates a problem for Augustine. If they're out there somewhere, how do we get at them, right? He didn't have, like I said, this radical dualism and this idea of an eternal soul that was already there. So and this is important. Again, you can't have a radical dualism actually in Christian thinking, because this radical dualism, which separates the intelligible from the sensible, would be this unbridgeable gap that Christianity can't accept, because you have this idea within Christianity of a revelation from God, this idea that God interacts with the physical world. So, this whole idea of an unbridgeable gap got to be rejected as well. Now, Plotinus places the forms in the nous. If you remember, this is a first emanation from the one. Augustine is going to respond by saying that the forms are not out there, they're not in the one, they're not in the nous, they're in the mind of God. Okay, that's why they're eternal ideas, or the rationes aeternae, these unchangeable forms that have always been there, but they're in the mind of God. They're not out there. They're not a bunch of beings that exist independently of God. Okay, and he can't have a multiplicity of eternal beings. I mean, the ideas themselves are eternal. So if you had them existing anywhere other than the mind of God, then you would have a plurality of eternal existing beings, and you end up in what's more of a polytheism all of a sudden, and not monotheism. So they can't just be out there. They've got to be in God. And ultimately, the theology is that they're identical to God in a certain way that's going to be beyond where we can explain, in this lecture. But the question still remains, if they're in the mind of God, how do we get them? Right? How do we have access to that? How do we grasp the idea? Plato says recollection. Augustine is going to respond with something different. He says we're going to get the ideas here and now in this life. But how is that possible? Well, this is where God is going to play a very important role in the entire epistemology. He has what's called the theory of illumination. Okay, Augustine says we need to be illuminated. Now, the criterion of truth for Augustine is an internal criterion. The mind is ultimately governed by truth, right? You've got logical, you've got mathematical, you've got moral truths, right? We know these things, he believes, directly. They're not things that are caused by the senses, right? You don't learn logic and math and morality by looking at the sensible world. The sensible world gives us finite and imperfect ideas and I should just say things. But the mind is governed by truth. We don't make things true. We don't create truth. We simply discover it. Now, there must be something that makes truth necessary and makes it present to the mind if you can't get it through the senses. And that's what illumination is. It's an act of God where he does something to the individual. And the analogy is very similar to what Plato uses when he talks about the sun. Okay? God is going to replace Plato's good. God is to the mind as the sun is to the eye. If you remember the analogy again of the cave, the good is represented by the sun in that analogy. Right? It's the form of all forms. Well, God is like the sun. Think of it this way. The eye requires light to see. Now, the eye might function absolutely perfectly, But if you're in a dark room, if there's no sun shining, then your eye is still not going to be able to see. It can't see without the light that gives it the ability to see. Same thing with the mind. The mind has the ability to do lots of impressive things, but if there's no illumination of the mind, then the mind is not going to be able to think. And that illumination comes from God. Okay, so we see all truth through God's light. And the only way to get at truth is through this illumination. God has to do something. He has to move. He has to do something actively. And that's a supernatural activity in a way. And this is where it's going to get a little bit confusing. And part of the confusion is going to be the fact that Augustine really doesn't develop the theory of illumination where it answers every single question. Okay, so illumination implies that God is regularly active in human perception. He's always doing something to allow people to know, right? Illumination enables us to move from, our true beliefs and opinions about the world to have knowledge, right? That's why we could talk about making a judgment about the sense of world and calling it scientia, to calling it science, because of the process of illumination. This supernatural activity, what does that actually mean? What is God actually doing here? And that's up for debate. There are definitely at least three possibilities of what God does when it comes to illumination. It could be the case that God simply is just giving man an ability to judge what he encounters in the world with a degree of certainty. It could be, number two, that he's infusing the mind of man with vague representations of these eternal ideas, which are going to then act as standards by which we judge. Or he could be actually adding full content into the mind of man, right? Which would be closer to Plato's idea of a priori knowledge. Okay, so whatever it is, again, it's not clear in Augustine's writings. But he's concerned with us eventually arriving at our ultimate knowledge, which is our knowledge of God. And that's going to be what attains the greatest good, the greatest pleasure, what he ultimately calls beatitude or blessedness. Now, this is the counterpart to Plotinus' union with the One. True knowledge is necessary for true happiness. So you have to have this ultimate knowledge of God to be ultimately happy, to reach our ultimate and final end, the thing for which we're created in the first place. Now, certain forms of knowledge are accessible to all people, right? We could all know certain things, and that's thanks to illumination, our reason plus illumination. Now, he says those things, reason and illumination, are insufficient for knowing the highest knowledge. You can't know God merely through reason and illumination. Now, all men have reason and illumination, but not all men know God. Now, this is where it becomes, I think, a little bit confusing. Number one, the divine ideas are in a certain sense identical with God. So if we know any of the divine ideas, in a way, we should say we know God. He's going to say, well, we can't know God fully. Knowledge of God requires another act of God that he's going to talk about as grace, or he can also refer to it as revelation or even illumination. Now, there's a distinction between nature and grace in Augustine. The idea of what we can do naturally speaking, what's given to us by nature versus what's given to us supernaturally by God. That's what grace is. It's something that's given supernaturally. Now, we just said everybody is illumined. Everybody has reason and illumination, which allows us to know. And we just said illumination is an act of God, which seems to be some kind of supernatural act. So how, then, is illumination different from grace? It seems like grace at this point. But he says you need something different to gain access to God. So is there a different type of illumination? Where's the exact distinction? Like I said, we might not be able to find that answer in Augustine. Again, depends on your perspective on how you interpret Augustine's writings. But I'm going to leave it there with a kind of a question mark because it's not a fully developed theory, I think, at the point where Augustine leaves it. But the idea at this point is you do need God to know things, and you definitely need God to help you know God himself. All right, and that's really the important part in his theology. So for a full vision, for full blessedness, for full beatitude, that actually is going to be reserved for the next life. For Augustine, this is something you attain after you die. So maybe we don't have to worry about full knowledge of God in this life anyways. Let's go on to this idea of free will, nature of evil, and then kind of wrap up with some of his political philosophy. So another big question has to do with ethics, and it's the concept of freedom. the free will of the individual. This has to do with moral responsibility in what might otherwise be viewed as a deterministic universe. And here's the big question. If you have a God out there who is omniscient, who knows everything, and is also at the same time just, and let's put it this way. If God is omniscient, it would seem to imply that the universe is in some way deterministic. Cicero, for instance, in the ancient world, and this was somebody that Augustine read, makes the case that if God knows the future, then it's causally determined, right? You can't change the future, because if God knows it infallibly, then it's going to come to pass. Therefore, it's kind of set in stone. So we would say it's determined, and therefore the choices that we make are not really freely chosen, right? There's no such thing as true free choice if that's the situation. Freedom requires, and this is what's called the libertarian view of freedom, it requires there to be no causation or determination, and it requires that there are true alternate possibilities that we can choose between. Okay? Now, determinism says that there is some sort of causation. Now, on the opposite ends of the spectrum on this particular issue, you've got what's called fatalism, where there's absolutely no freedom. And then you've got libertarianism, where there is freedom, but there's absolutely no determinism. Okay, those are incompatible viewpoints. Now, Augustine is actually what's called a compatibilist. He's going to believe that there is freedom and there is determinism, maybe in a weaker sense. It's called a soft determinism. And he says God can know the future, and he could hold us responsible for what he does and still be just, because we have the ability to choose for ourselves what we want. Okay, so this idea of compatibilism is a little bit confusing or tricky. So freedom is simply the ability to choose according to your greatest desire. He actually rejects this libertarian idea of freedom as in there's no causation whatsoever. He says, yeah, there is causation, but as long as we could choose according to our desire what we want to choose, that's what we mean by freedom, right? So it takes into consideration the fact that there are causes and effects, right? That's what makes science possible. The universe works according to cause and effect. The will is just an ability to choose. It doesn't say why we choose necessarily, right? We may choose out of habit. We might choose out of a desire. We might choose because of some other reason. There are lots of variables in the choosing process that are not chosen themselves, okay? That's the idea of causation that's kind of built in. When we talk about determinism from Augustine's point of view, it has to include our desires. It has to include our intentions. It has to work with the will, not against the will, all right? So what the will ends up being is a faculty of choice that we might call a second-order volition, all right? So he's going to distinguish between what are called first and second-order volitions, or willing. So a first-order volition, this is going to be a really, really bad example. Let's talk about you going on a diet, and you want to be healthy. So you want to avoid eating foods that are not good for you. That's a desire that you have. You have another desire to eat something like the pizza you smell cooking in the other room. So you've got two, what we might call first-order desires. The will, he says, is a second-order volition, or a second-order activity, which allows us to choose between those first-order volitions. Okay, helps us to navigate. Now, of course, those first-order desires do pull on us. They are causally related to what we ultimately end up doing. Okay, but they don't completely control us. And the fact that we have this second-order ability to choose between those other desires is where moral responsibility comes in. Let's think of it this way. We don't control the things that present themselves to us, right? We don't have control over the objects like the pizza cooking in the other room. If you smell the pizza cooking, that's not something you could have controlled. We don't control whether or not we delight or are repulsed by the smell of the pizza, right? That's something, again, that is beyond our control. Our actions we can control, but whether we succeed or fail in our pursuits is not always up to us either. So, for instance, I can smell involuntarily the pizza. I can all of a sudden have this desire emerge within me for a taste of that pizza, and then I can actually decide to go ahead and grab a piece of the pizza, but somebody can come along right before me and snatch it out of my hands, okay? In which case I've acted, but I failed to obtain what I was after. All right, none of those things are things that were in my control. The only thing that was in my control is my inner consent that caused me to go ahead and move towards the pizza. right? And at that level, that's where the will kicks in, and that's where our responsibility kicks in. Lots of things we can't control, but as long as I can control the initiation of my will towards my desires, that's all that it matters, okay, for me to be responsible. Anyways, what's related to this is this idea of a goodwill, right? So we've got the ability to will freely, but what exactly is a goodwill? Well, this is going to relate to his question of evil, and this was the big problem for him early on. What is the nature of evil? What exactly is evil? Is evil a thing? And he's going to come up with this idea based on Platonic thinking, or Platonism, or rather Neoplatonism, that evil is actually not a thing, at least a thing in itself. It's rather a privation in a thing. So we could say it's a privation in what's good, right? Everything that exists is good insofar that it exists, that it has being. Now, Manichaeism didn't have this. Manichaeism, remember, had this idea that there was good and there was evil, that there were things struggling with one another. So it made evil really kind of a thing out there. But good is being. Privation is not a nothing, but it is a relative non-being. In other words, this means it's the absence of something that should be present within a being. Okay? So when it comes to moral evil, we can think of when we will to choose something that is not the greatest good. That would be a type of bad will, right? The idea of evil is when we choose anything contrary to the greater good. That would be a privation, where we're seeking something that's less than it could be. The analogy I think that's really useful is using, again, a physical thing because it's easier for us to understand. So we can think of a dog, right? According to its nature, what a dog is, it should have 4 legs. If you see a dog that has 3 legs, there's something missing, right? That ought to be there. It's not that a missing leg is a thing, right? A missing leg isn't a thing. It doesn't exist. But it's a privation in something that does exist. And that's, again, what evil is. So I think that's a really useful analogy. Now, when we want to have a good will, this requires us to live a certain life. This is the life where we choose virtue. We choose the highest good where we can. Okay, and this is the way we're ultimately going to reach wisdom. And being virtuous is one of the keys to fulfilling our purpose in life. Okay, and it's all in the power of the will. What we end up doing is through our goodwill, and hopefully, it is freely chosen. He also talks about the particular virtues that we know as cardinal virtues. These go all the way back to Plato and even beyond. But prudentia, fortitudo, temperantia, and justitia, basically the idea of wisdom, courage, self-control, and justice. So prudentia is the idea of knowledge of what is to be pursued and avoided, right? What is the wise things to pursue? What are the wise things to avoid as we move and navigate through life? Fortitudo, or courage, is the state by which we spurn misfortune. We resist failing and giving up. We continue to press forward. Temperantia is the idea where we control our desires, at least avoid things that are shameful, check our passions. The Stoics would have embraced that as one of the highest virtues. And then justitia, or justice, which is the idea of giving people what they deserve, right? So he's got in his philosophy the traditional cardinal virtues taken out of Platonism. He also would add to these, the spiritual virtues that we get from the New Testament, like faith, hope, and love. There are lots of different virtues that end up being out there, but these are some of the big ones philosophically. And then the last thing I'm just going to hit real quickly is this idea of just war theory, because as we're now moving into a realm of a Christian world, right? Constantine legalized Christianity. Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And a dilemma emerges where earlier Christians avoided military service. They had avoided participating in warfare. And as the whole empire becomes more and more Christian, even being forced to push people into Christianity, what do you do with the military? What do you do with politics? What do you do with the securing of the state? It seems like that's usually a pretty big role of the state to engage in war where it's necessary. So how can a Christian king declare war? How can a Christian soldier, how can a Christian be a soldier and go to war? Well, he's going to develop what's called the just war theory, and this is going to be elaborated on by thinkers after him, but it's really an important development in the history of human thought. So here's what the keys are. It's based on intent and action. Augustine is going to say, if we're going to go to war, and sometimes it's necessary to go to war, there need to be criteria that are fulfilled. Number one, there has to be the right cause. There has to be a just cause. If there's no just cause, then you should not engage in violence, period. Secondly, you have to have legitimate authority. There has to be a government or somebody in a position of leadership to declare war. It's not just something anybody can just pick up a weapon and harm another person, right? That kind of stuff is illegitimate. The type of idea where people rise up against the government would also be considered kind of an unjust war, and according to at least this theory. You also have to have right intention, and the ultimate intention has to be to assume a position of peace once again, right? To end the war, right? To make life possible in harmony. So the right intention has to be there. It's not ever for the sake of wealth. It's not for the sake of power. It's not for the sake of expanding your borders. Those are not right intentions. You have to also have the possibility or probability, rather, of success. Okay, it's more than just possibility, it's probability. It has to be likely that you're going to succeed, because if it's utterly doomed to failure, then really you should not risk the idea of more people dying on a hopeless cause. So there has to be at least probability there. Then you also have to have the proportionality of violence. Okay, the idea that you don't escalate the warfare, you don't use a gun in a knife fight, right? That idea has to be equal and balanced. All right, you don't harm innocents, right? You don't extend the violence to people that are non-combatants. That all that kind of stuff comes in with Augustine. And then it also has to be the very last resort, right? If it's not the last option on the table, if you haven't exhausted all other options, try to avoid war, then you are just in finally declaring war. Okay, so here's a thinker who has a lot of stuff to say about lots of different areas, from ontology to epistemology to theories on ethics and morality in politics and war. Heavily influenced by Plato, Plotinus, the thinkers that came before him, but you can see how he's now trying to wrestle with how these things line up with Christianity. And that's going to be the big thing, right? If something clearly conflicts with Christianity, then he tends to abandon it. He's not always completely successful. This is a process, but you're going to see over and over again, going further forward, a lot of monotheists, not only Christians, but Jews and Muslims, start to embrace thinkers like Plotinus and later thinkers like Aristotle, and develop theology and philosophy that is going to ultimately impact the modern era, which has technically become more and more non-religious in nature, but the religious development is really important to look at, because some of the greatest thinkers in the history of philosophy happen to be some of these theologians that come out of these different traditions. So think about Augustine. He's going to have a big impact on where we're going with the Middle Ages. And for now, we're just going to leave it at that.